Afraid that she was not enough, that she would always be found wanting, that's where God met Bernice McDonald and showed her the proper place for fear. Now she encourages other women to take tiny, brave steps. Welcome to the Grace Cycle Show. I'm your host, Karen Dittman, and this is your place to stop striving and discover how to thrive by God's grace. Bernice, welcome to the Grace Cycle Show.
It's so great to be here, Karen. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I'm excited for our conversation today. And I'm going to invite you to just jump in here from the beginning and share with us your story of how you saw God at work in your life by His grace.
That's well, I always say I have had so much grace poured over me my entire life. I was a very imaginative child. And so, I want to preempt the story that I am going to share with the idea that I just wanted to be a good girl. And, I wanted to do all the things that I was taught was right and never get in trouble and all of that sort of thing. I was very observant of the people around me. And so I think that's why I took on this statement in my life very early. It was from a story from the book of Daniel. And I think it must have been probably at camp 1 year or, sometime like that, where the story of how there was that mysterious writing on the wall, for King, I think it was King anyways.
Bill, yeah.
Yes, that's it. Thank you. And Daniel interpreted the writing, right? And it said on there, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. And really, I think that became the story of my life in many ways. I took on that attitude so I was looking at everything through that lens. And so I had a lot of fear in my life. I was afraid that I wasn't enough. And so as I grew up, I went to college. I struggled through my 20s. I finally met someone who wanted to marry me. And I thought that would never happen because who would want to marry me, right? So I got married and had two beautiful daughters and struggled all the way through that marriage. Really, I had chosen someone who was kind of like, was like trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, that sort of thing. And so 24 years later, I made the decision to leave that marriage. And we had tried all kinds of things, counseling and gone back and forth, really talked through a lot of things. And I had been very involved in my church, always wanting to live and be, again, still the good person. I wanted to please God. I wanted to live a life that was a reflection of who He was. And so it was very hard to make that decision to walk away. But I was so hard inside and so distressed. It was like my youngest daughter was just graduating high school. And I thought ahead to the rest of my life and thought, I just can't continue to do this. And there were many reasons that are condoned for leaving the marriage. But I think the real story came in the time after I left my marriage. Because as much as I was, I had such a deep, loving relationship with God, in many ways, God stepped in and became the love that I needed, that my husband couldn't give me. He became the one I went to, the one I spent a lot of time with. And so I thought at that time that I was making the right choice and then God was blessing that. And I really believe to this day, God did release me from that marriage. However, I wasn't prepared for, even though I had kind of a mix of shock and relief at the same time. But it was as if suddenly there was a huge cloud between me and God. And I was again weighed in the balance and found wanting. I hadn't been able to make this a success, my marriage a success. And so I felt my life was not a success. It changed everything. I actually moved away from my town. I moved away from my community, my friends, everything I knew, and moved into the city that was nearby. I'm in Canada, so it was about 25 kilometers away. And I had to start a new life. And it was so difficult. I can't describe how, on one hand, I felt independent. I felt like I was gaining some strength, like I had taken a stand for myself. And on the other hand, I felt like I was shunned in
Mm.
lots of ways. I did have good meaning friends, Christian friends, sit down with me and say, "Are you sure this is what you should be doing?" But the thing that taught me was that you can't know somebody else's story
True.
until you actually live it. And so I took that all as a grain of salt and I just started to move forward. But I can honestly say, in the 6 years that I was single, I actually became more myself than I ever have and ever had been in my life. And I think it was because I had to meet fear face to face and I had to ask myself the question, who do I want? Even in the middle of this, who do I want to be? And then a second really important question was, who tells me who I am?
Mm.
And that was a difficult question that I had, because I was always thinking I was weighed in the balance. It was as if I was standing on the outside of a glass jar. I always thought of it looking inside. And inside was this beautiful family that had everything, these women that had everything. They were perfect Christian women who, they had the money, they had the home, they had the children, all of that. And I was always on the outside looking in and I couldn't get through that glass. And so in that time, I learned so much as I walked that path from divorce to my second marriage. And it's a journey I would never wish on my worst enemy, but it's a journey that I am so grateful I was able to take. So I think that the key things during that time was that I had to look fear right in the eye and I had to decide if I was going to listen to the fear or if I was going to just keep walking in faith and just keep putting in one foot in front of the other and keep taking those steps, even if it didn't, even if it felt uncomfortable, even if I didn't know who I was in this weird place. I was renting a home and my younger daughter got married a year later. And suddenly I needed roommates because at that time, still is, I guess, our rent was very high. And so I had to take in roommates, which was very weird, because I felt like I was taking a step back into my 20s. And here I was in my 40s, actually almost my 50s.
Mm.
So that's where my story lays, though, is in those years, those 6 years, because as I grew, I learned to face my fear and I had to embrace who I was. I had to really see who I was and what more. It's like everything was stripped away. So there I was alone with cells, standing there on my path, with all these bombs going off in my life. And I just had to ask the question, who do I? And at the end of that time, I really discovered that that's exactly who we are. It's people, individuals, walking a path from birth to death. And along the way, these bombs go off and rocks drop on you out of the blue, flattening you for a while. People throw rocks of criticism and judgment and expectation at you. And in the middle of that, we have to decide, and I believe that this is what God wants for our lives. We have to decide who we're going to be. Are we going to be people with character? Are we going to grow our character in that? Or are we just going to sit down in our past and say, well, I guess this is all.
Yeah.
So,
You said something earlier about living with the fear that you weren't enough. And I think that's something that a lot of women can relate to. And then when we make decisions in life that come from that fear, like the person you chose to marry, in a sense, when we're living out of that fear, it reinforces it, doesn't it?
that's
Yeah.
for sure. And what I do now, I work with women in midlife. And that's exactly what I do is take them from that place of not enough to being brave enough. Not even to being enough, where they see themselves as, yes, I'm strong enough. Yeah. it's we need to have that courage to actually face what it is that's going on. And we need to just find that bravery to take that one step, face that fear, decide who we are in the middle, and go forward with that. Living in the land of not enough, as I think of it, that was my life before I left, like, because it's the lens you look through. And
Right.
when you look at life through that lens, if you always, no matter what happens, you don't put a good spin on it. You always are second guessing yourself. So you're always wondering what other people are thinking about you. You're always
Hmm.
wondering if you're capable enough to do the thing that you're doing next, or if you're just inflating your own sense of, intelligence or
Yeah.
leadership or whatever.
Right. I talk to a lot of women who they live in this place where they've grown up with these messages, you're not enough and you're too much. And that is a hard place. It's very conflicting.
Right.
Yeah.
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 I, and that was just so much a part of it too,
Mhm.
because even as a child, I remember, in fact, I know as I've been thinking and as I've written my books, because my books are about living with courage as we face all these courage blocks. But I remember my dad, and he's a wonderful man, and he was trying on a very small salary to provide for a family of seven, five kids, very close together, living in a 700 square foot house.
Wow.
Yeah. And, I mean, there was never quiet. It was always noisy. There was always conflict, and he was always financially stressed. So when I would approach him to ask him anything, he would get this wrinkled brow, and I would immediately interpret that as me being an irritation. And he was just irritated with me. And so I would kind of quietly ask for something, say, "Can I have a quarter to go to the store?" And he would respond with this irritation, like, "Oh, what do you think? I'm made of money?"
Mhm.
But I mean, those are the little things. And I worked through that with my dad, and we ended up with a very good relationship because I started to understand right from his way. And but it was those kinds of stories, those sorts of things that cause us to feel as if we're not enough. And we're also too much. You're
Yeah.
always asking me for something. What do you think that I
Mm.
can, or you're too loud, or you're too, you're too passionate. You're too, you laugh too loud. Your hair's too much. All of those
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. A lot of those things. We get those messages, and I don't think people even intentionally send them our way, but yeah, we get that.
It's
So,
life.
yeah. So I want to go to this 6-year time period that was so transitional for you. After your divorce and you'd moved to another city or you'd moved to the city and it was you and God. And I'd love to hear some more about where God met you and how God met you and taught you courage.
Yeah. Yeah. A tiny brave steps.
Yeah.
That's that's as I look back over that time, it really was one little thing. And he was so faithful in just introducing me to things one at a time. For example, I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but I do say it anyways. I came out of my marriage so hungry for wealth. And I decided to set a future vision for myself. I said, I just want to know what real love is like once before I die. I
Mm.
said that and I wrote that in my journal many times. Not sure that God was listening at that time. I know he was, but I just did that. And so I began to realize that what I needed to do was find out what a healthy relationship actually looks like. And so I had just trained as a life coach at that time before my marriage ended. And so I decided, well, I'm not exactly in a place where I'm going to be able to help other women right now. However, I can still learn more. And so I signed up for a couple of more coaching courses on relationships.
Hmm.
And so through learning how to coach couples and learning how to coach singles, I actually learned so much about what a healthy relationship can look like. That didn't mean that I had it all together though, because during that time, I think I had my heart broken a couple of times worse, almost what I felt coming out of my marriage, because I realized that so I was going to reach that goal of finding the love I wanted, I needed to date. And so I entered that scary world of dating, which hadn't been there for a very long time. And I was following a coach actually introduced me to the concept of how to deal with fear. And what she said was, when you go out and when you go, you're going to be afraid. Fear is going to show up. That's a given because you're dating and this is scary and you never know what's out there. However, what I want you to do is I want you to look that fear in the eye and I want you to say, thank you so much for trying to protect me. But now I want you to go over there in the corner and eat a cookie because I need to go forward anyway and do this thing. And so
Mm.
I took that so much to heart. That's how I would envision my fear being outside myself, which I've learned is a very common psychological practice to take your emotions and see them as separate from you. And so I just got this idea in my head that, yes, I feel afraid, but I still need to make a decision about what I'm going to do, even though I feel that fear. And I need to move forward anyway.
Mhm.
And so that's what I began to do.
I
Yeah,
was gonna say that's great because I have said many times, our emotions are real and we need to feel the feelings, but they point us to where we are. They don't get in the driver's seat and take us anywhere. We have to go where we want to go. And so whether it's fear or something else, we can't let that be in control, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where you find a lot of your strength and where you begin to really embrace who you truly are is when you begin to take back your control. And in a sense, interesting you should say that because that's how I ended up seeing fear. And I talk about it a lot that way. It's like I actually named my fear friend.
Okay.
So, yeah,
That's great.
he has a name, yeah. And he rides in the back seat while I drive the car. And another book, Elizabeth Gilbert, I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She wrote a book called Big Magic, which was about the fear of being creative and getting out there and naturally using your gifts. And so she said that that's what she did with her fear was she actually would have conversations with it. And she would say, I know you're here and you are never going to not be here. So we're going to deal with this and you can come along for the ride and I will hear what you're saying and I will listen to what you're saying and acknowledge that, but you will never have control of this steering wheel. I am always driving the car, just like you were saying.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And as you were talking about, wanting to know what a healthy relationship looked like, and it's so true. It's one thing to study it and learn about it, but then you really did have to put it into practice and take those risks. And
Yeah, women in that situation, a lot of times they talk about making their list. And I did that. I'll pay for the kind of relationship I want. What kind of man am I going to need to be looking for? And so I would make that list. However, all of a sudden I realized, and I think this was through the coaching course I was taking, I needed to insert myself into that
mm,
equation and say, if I'm going to have a relationship like that, thinking I need to be in that.
that, that's a really important question. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That is so important for a healthy relationship. We do need to be aware of who we'd want to be in relationship with, but also who do I need to be? Yeah.
And I almost think that's more important because I believe that the person we attract is going to be somebody who is attracted to someone like us. They're looking for someone like us. And I think it's really important for us to be very real, to be very transparent as a woman so that a man knows what he's getting.
Mhm.
Like just like we want a man to show us who he is. I mean, we don't see all the good, bad, and the ugly right and we don't show that either. But we do need to know ourselves well enough so that we can say, this is who I am. This is what I stand for. These are my values. This is what I prefer.
Mm.
This is what I like to do or to have or to be. And so that he knows who he's with, because I think that's what happened in my first marriage is I was trying so hard in the beginning to be the person that he would want,
Mm.
because I wanted to get married. And I had a habit of being a million
Yeah.
that way to whoever I was with. And that was true not just of in romantic relationships, but in friendships and in church relationships and in whatever. I was trying and looking for that approval so much that I would become who I thought people wanted me to be.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, I can relate to that, and I know a lot of people can. And so I think that shows the courage that you had to move 25 kilometers away to start over and to figure out who you really were too. Yeah.
As hard as it was as if well, I mean, I feel so bad for my daughters now because it was as if their mom disappeared for a few
Mm.
years. They didn't know who I was either because the things I was doing and who I was being at that time, trying to find out who I was, because I just said, I don't care. I'm going to be, I'm going to do some things that I really want to do and see if that's who I want to be. It's almost like a trial and error thing. And I regret a lot of the things I did then. They were mistakes. But I also am so glad that I walked through that because at the end of that 6 years, when I met my second husband, I and I had been asking God for years also, don't you have one knight in shining armor out there somewhere? Can you send me just one knight in shining armor? So what by the time I met my husband, and I'll tell you how in a second, but I was to the place where I was content to be who I was. And I was content to stay as I was. If the opposite, like if being with somebody meant that I was with somebody that, I was going to have to set my values aside for it or to accept as, something less than what I really wanted in a relationship. It was like instead of needing someone, I want one. And I wish
Mm.
I had been at that place when I was in my early 20s before I got married the first time. I so wish I had that, but I didn't, and that's okay. But anyway, my husband rescued me one night when my car needs. And so
Oh,
we laugh about it because you see, God has such a sense of humor
yes.
because, he sat me a night and he's just the kindest and exactly the man that is perfect for me. All of what I wanted he is. And, 14 years later, we still feel that way. And, as many hard times as we've been through and all of the things we've had to encounter, we always come back to that center that we are just so glad that we found each other. He was a widower. His wife had passed away a year before. He had been with her for 7 years, I think it was, so, but he had decided to, but he didn't want to be alone for the rest of his life. And that means looking for someone. And so, we met that need for each other and were married exactly a year to the day that we met or
Mm.
went on our first date. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, that's sweet. That's really sweet. So a minute ago, you were talking about tiny, brave steps, which I know is something that you talk a lot about. So, what does that mean, and why are the tiny steps so powerful?
They are so powerful, right? And I know you talk about that in your work too, somewhat, right? Just in
Yeah, I
a
talk
little
about,
different way.
yeah, one simple change. So, yeah, one step in a new direction. Yeah.
And it's the small things. Sometimes we think, well, I imagine this because I had this bridge in the park where I live that I would go to, a couple of times a week, and I would see at the end of the bridge, the place where I wanted to be. In fact, at the end of the bridge was this museum that had a little chapel just inside a fence. And I would see that chapel and I'd say, I want to create that new life. And so from the beginning of the bridge, I would walk on that bridge and I would imagine myself taking small steps. Every little slat in the bridge was a small step. It was impossible for me to jump as much as I would have liked to leap from the beginning of the bridge right to the end of the bridge. I needed to take those small steps one at a time across that bridge in order to get to the other side. And so I practiced that in my head to try to, help myself have patience, help myself realize that everything I was learning, everything in whether it was a day, whether it was a month, a year, all of those little steps on took, learning something new, believing something new about myself, writing something. I kept a strengths journal. So I would write who I wanted to be in that strengths journal. I would put quotes in there. I would put scripture. I would put passages from a book I had read. I would put that in, and each of those was a tiny brave step that was saying, yes, I believe I am going to become that person. I am reaching for that future self. And I am, and as I did that, what happened was even me in the present became more fulfilled. I became, because I had purpose, and even on my hardest days, somehow I knew that this was all purpose. It was part of getting to where I want. So
Yeah, and
those.
I think that's a lot of how God works in our lives. When something needs to change, I was just sharing this illustration this morning. Like if I decide I need to lose 15 pounds, and so I throw out everything in the pantry that I think is unhealthy, and I go sign up for an exercise class that I'm going to do 6 days a week and all this. And then I show up for the exercise class and it's full, and oh, well, no big deal. And then I go to the grocery store and the cookies are back in my cart. Yeah, those huge things to overhaul, they just don't work. But if I can do one little thing different just today, and then build on it. Like you said, one step at a time. You can't jump over the bridge. You have to take one step at a time to get across.
Get there. If
Yes.
you settle in to do that, to just take that little step inside of you, even that little mind shift, you do get there. And look, and you'll see that when you look back. You
Hmm.
don't see it when you're in the present. You only see it when you look back over your shoulder and you see how far you've come and you see how far you've changed.
That's so true. And I love that you talked about keeping a strength journal and writing down all of the things that you wanted to be true of you. And I really
Mhm.
think journaling is powerful because sometimes we forget where we've come from.
Oh, so true. I know. It's like I heard once somebody say, and I thought, this, I got to remember this forever. We wake up in the morning and it's like we start all over again. Our brains really need to be reminded of what we stand for and what is true. Because as you know, that strength journal, when I would slip back into dark moments, and we always do, right? I would go and read what I had put in that journal. And it would again remind me of who the hope would come up again. The
Yeah.
belief would come up again because I would get the same emotion that I had when I'd written about in the book in the first place. That it became such a source of vision for me, that got me through some really hard days.
That's great. So, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to share a big takeaway for our audience. But before I go there, how can people get in touch with you, get copies of your books? How can we reach out to you?
Well, my books are on Amazon, and also I have a website called tinybravesteps.com. And on there is a tool that I have developed. It's an AI tool that actually is like sitting down with a coach. It's called the Tiny Brave Steps Generator, and it's free. And they on my site, tinybravesteps.com, they can opt in to use that generator and just pour their heart out
Mm,
into this. It's private, it's personal, and it will actually answer and guide you through your thoughts and help you figure out what you're feeling and how to manage that, what your strengths are. And then in the end of that discussion, it will give you one 90-second step and 2 5-minute steps that you can take instantly. I've had so many women tell me it is truly amazing. It's just like and for me, I go there all the time and I've used it a lot to talk, find out answers for my business, for my personal life, for relationships, how to like work with my adult children, all of those sorts of things, how to lose weight, that like the best ways to do that. And it really is an amazing tool. So yeah, I just want to offer that to all of your listeners to try that out. It'll change their lives.
That sounds like a really powerful tool. Thank you for that gift. Yeah. So if there's one thing that you want our audience to take away from this conversation, what would it be?
I think a quote that got me through all the way through those 6 years. And then my husband and I took this on together too. It's by someone called Ambrose Redmoon, and it says this: courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important. And he thinks that we need to always know, always assess when we're in that fear place. Who do I want to be? And what is more important right here in this moment than me listening to my fear and holding back? What is the thing that I need to make a decision to do and put that fear in the box?
Mm, that is really powerful. Thank you, Bernice. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today on the Grace Cycle Show.
It's been wonderful being here, Karen. Thank you. I really have enjoyed our discussion.
Me too. Bernice shared so many powerful lessons from her story today. I loved the power of keeping a journal to remind you of who you want to be. That's something that will stick with me. And also the reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the belief that something else is more important. While Bernice talks about tiny, brave steps, I wrote in Thriving in Grace about one simple change as part of the Grace Cycle. And you can download a copy of that Grace chapter from the book on my website at KarenADittman.com. So that's it for today. Until next time, remember, get curious, stay connected, and live in grace.